Happy Halloween. As a special treat and to help get my YouTube channel off the ground a little bit, I'm going to be doing a full reading of my brand new story, The Black City, which is featured in the new Wicked Shadow Press anthology, Halloweenthology, The Friar's Lantern. So let's get into it. The Black City. My name is Robert Cranshaw. Yes, that Robert Cranshaw, the horror writer. You may have heard of me, or maybe not. I guess I'm pretty famous in some circles, among people who like their terror weird and bloody and extreme. The irony is that I've spent most of my life trying to run away from the horrors that I write about. The stories of Valtris the Bloody, of blasphemous Care, priest of dead stars, and of that cursed black city that haunts dreams and drives men to madness. I have spent my life running away from those abominations, but tonight, on Halloween night, I know I must return. My story truly starts 20 years ago tonight, when I was only 9 years old. I was a normal kid with normal parents, living in a normal suburban home. I had a cat named Bailey, and I loved cartoons like Voltron. I was as far away from famous horror writer as a person could be. I had no interest in horror movies or scary stories. I wouldn't even read Goosebumps. The only thing spooky I really enjoyed at that age was Halloween. That night of candy and drugstore costumes and plastic skeletons. I looked forward to it as any child would. I had no knowledge of its true origins. That thinning of the veil between the living and the dead, or the dark spirits that walked among us until dawn's light banished them again. Banished them back to the Black City. It was the first year my parents let me go trick-or-treating without them, as I had managed to befriend a group of other kids in my elementary school, and we all decided at the ripe old age of 9 that we didn't need adults to supervise us anymore, and that we could don our costumes and parade through our quiet suburb all by ourselves, gathering treats and playing the occasional trick, harmless pranks that caused the adults to wag a finger at us as they chuckled under their breath. We started at dusk, just as the street lights were flickering on, and I remember it felt like the greatest night of my life. I was dressed in a box store Dracula costume my mom had bought for me, my black and red satin cape flapping gracefully in the October breeze. I remember the toothy grin of the plastic fangs that filled my mouth with saliva and made my friends ooh and ah as I said, "I want to suck your blood," in a terrible accent that was more Sesame Street than Bela Lugosi. We practically bounced from house to house, yelling trick or treat, holding out our pillowcases and plastic pumpkins, eager to receive Hershey bars and popcorn balls and peanut butter cups. Any house that didn't have lights on received our wrath. Cans of Silly String, Billy Willett, and Walter Monroe had brought, sprayed across the front steps and fences as the rest of us laughed. Thinking back, it was the last time I ever felt happy. As it got late for 9-year-olds anyway, and our treat bags got heavy, the group started to thin out, with kids peeling off and heading home to examine their bounty of sugary confections. I was headed home myself when I first encountered it, the Black City. Walking up Barn Street towards home, flickering lights caught my eye, and I found myself looking down a road that shouldn't have been there. It was narrow and flanked by tall trees on either side, trees I didn't recognize, and there were luminaria lining the road at irregular intervals. I had no idea what a luminaria was back then, but since that night I've been over every detail again and again, and as a writer I've learned a lot of new words. Of course, I was a curious 9-year-old, and I didn't really understand the danger this unexpected situation posed. So I followed the dark, winding path between the eerily glowing lights, just to see where it led. As soon as I started down that strange road, I remember how the world changed. The wind rattled the tree branches like clattering bones, and there was a low moaning that made me shiver. The air took on a heavy, wet quality with a sour, earthy smell. My eyes darting left and right, catching glimpses of shadowy figures that seemed to flit in and out of my peripheral vision. But I was on a Halloween high. I wasn't afraid. I was intrigued. I wish I had been afraid. I had only been following the path for 15 minutes when I saw the gate posts flanking either side of the road. They were like something out of a scary movie, tall and crooked, made of crumbling blocks of a dark, mottled gray stone and covered with black, wet moss. I saw something move out of the corner of my eye that made me jump. Something long and skinny and glistening, but it was gone before I could get a look. Thank God for small mercies. As I passed through those cursed gates, the city, that black, blasphemous city, rose before me. I remember onyx spires and dark archways and rough cobblestone streets that wound maze-like between menacing buildings, with windows that glared down at me like empty eye sockets. I had no idea where I was. It was like no place I had ever seen before. But I knew wherever I wasn't supposed to be there, and I was finally becoming afraid. I started to turn around to head back home as fast as my legs could carry me, but I heard something on the path behind me, on the road I had followed to the city, and it sounded like voices, but deep and guttural. I ran deeper into the city until I found an alcove to duck into, and I crouched and waited. Two things came into view from around the corner, and I had to bite the fleshy part of my hand to keep from crying out in terror. One was tall and thin, covered in grimy rags, with long, stringy hair that seemed to wriggle and writhe all on its own. The thing had a face like a skull with too pale skin pulled tight over it, and eyes that looked like black, empty sockets with tiny flickers of red light within. The other creature was half the height of the first, grotesque and bulbous and shuffling along on squat, flabby legs. Its whole body jiggled as if it was made of some sickly gray gelatin, and I realized as it spoke that its rotund belly opened in a horizontal slit, a gaping maw with bits of pink flesh still stuck on needle-like teeth. "Well, I don't know why he needs us back," the shorter creature spoke in a thick, guttural accent that I could still frighteningly understand. "I just know Kerr himself called us to return, so we must return. Must be important to call us back now." "But I'm still hungry," the taller fiend moaned, elongated fingers clutching an emaciated belly. "It's the only night we get to go out there and..." "Here, I was saving this, but I'm already sick of hearing you moan," the fat thing hissed as it tossed a chunk of pink, bloody flesh at its companion, who snatched it out of the air and devoured it with sickening, wet sounds as the pair turned the corner and disappeared up the cobbled road, headed back towards the dark, malevolent spire that seemed to be the center of the Black City. I sat there, shaking and crying and unsure what to do. I was only 9 years old, and I had found myself in a literal nightmare, with no idea how to get out. I heard more sounds, more footsteps on the cobblestone streets. I heard sickly, gelatinous sounds, rattling sounds, moaning and hissing and ripping and tearing sounds as I hid there in my alcove. I heard snippets of their horrible conversations as well, as the demoniac creatures lumbered and shambled up the twisted streets. I heard them speak of Kerr, the priest of dead stars, and of Vulturus, who flays the flesh of the penitent, and of the Zephyrion, flapping of their leathery wings, filling the night with terrors untold. I tried not to look. I really tried. But even terrified, even frightened beyond all reason, I was still a curious 9-year-old boy, and so I peeked. I saw the death priest, Morthus, with his living crown of blood and bone, walking regally up the street with flabby, misshapen creatures following him, carrying the edges of his long robe, which seemed to be made of living, writhing flesh. I saw Grine and Trine, twin horrors conjoined in the middle, a bloody gash between them where they were sewn together by their mother, the Empress of Crows. The more I stared, the more I saw and heard, the more I knew, and I think, the more my sanity fled. The more the terror filled my heart. Shuddering and crying, I looked up at the night sky for comfort, but saw only those dead black stars and a hollow moon looking back at me, staring into me. At some point, I was startled not by noise, but by silence. I heard no voices, no flopping or chittering steps, no blasphemous conversations. All was quiet, and I felt it would be my best and possibly only chance for escape. I left the safety of my small alcove and hurried down the street the way I had come, headed again for those hideous gates. As I rounded a corner and saw them, I knew I was free. There were no creatures in sight, the road was clear, and I started to run. Nearly the gate, however, I stopped as something glinting on the ground in the moonlight caught my eye. It was a silver coin, about the size of a quarter, but it was heavy, and it felt strange in my small hand. I could see there were strange markings or sigils on it, but they made my eyes hurt when I looked at them too closely. I put the coin in my pocket and I rushed out of the gate and then continued down the road until I heard more sounds, more movement ahead, more wet, gravelly voices that seemed to be coming closer to me. I slipped off the path into those dark, ancient trees and I hid, cowering in the brush with branches scratching at my face and thorns tearing at my costume. That was the last thing I remember until morning when I heard voices calling my name. I woke to the first rays of sunrise flooding through the thin canopy of tree branches in a small wooded area I recognized, a few blocks from my home. I looked around, slowly recognizing where I was and trying to remember how I had gotten there. I remembered the Black City and its horrors, and I remembered hiding in those dark ancient woods, but that wasn't here. That wasn't where I found myself. I called out for help, and some of the grown-ups, Mr. Wilson from down the street and Mrs. Stein from the grocery store, came running over. I had never come home from trick-or-treating, and my parents had called the police and rallied the neighbors to search for me throughout the night. Reunited with my family, I tried to tell them what had happened, but of course no one believed me. I took them to the place where the road had appeared with its shimmering luminaria, but there was nothing there, just a field and some small trees. In the end, it was decided that I had gotten lost in the dark and fallen asleep in the woods and had bad dreams. And that story seems to satisfy everyone. Almost everyone. I was never the same after that night. I tried so hard to convince my parents of what really happened. Tried to tell the school counselor, but they just needed to believe the official story. I realize that now, even if I hadn't back then. They couldn't face the truth. They couldn't comprehend the idea of the Black City or its inhabitants, creatures of fable and nightmare who spill out into our world on that one blasphemous night to feast and revel and torment and torture. For years, I went back on Halloween night. I wanted to show others what I saw, but the road to the Black City never returned, and I just looked more crazy, more desperate. I resented the fact that nobody would believe me. But now, so many years later, I understand why they couldn't. I envy them. The rest, as they say in the movies, is history. I grew up with a myriad of psychological issues stemming from that night. Issues that could never really be diagnosed since the source of my trauma wasn't exactly covered in the textbooks. I had night terrors that woke me screaming, drenched in sweat, and saying such bizarre things like the river Goriel runs with blood, or the dead stars align to select our new sovereign. Eventually, the only way I could get any restful sleep was a cocktail of potent drugs. And even then, sometimes the nightmare world of the Black City would break through. As I graduated from high school with barely mediocre grades, I started writing about the Black City and my memories of it. My dreams, those images that would sometimes flood my mind on moonless nights when I was unable to sleep. I started doing it as a way to exorcise those images from my mind, and it worked for a time. But my thoughts, my dreams would always return to the Black City. I wrote a short story that was bought by a small horror zine, and that story garnered attention from an up-and-coming publisher you may have heard of, Dark Stones Press. Yes, them. I was their first signed author at the ripe old age of 19. We've both grown in popularity since those early days, after they published Black Temple of Night and then Priestess of the Dead Moon, my first bestseller. After Amazon bought the film rights to that one, things really started to take off. I kept writing. I kept trying to run away from the Black City and the events of that Halloween night. But the pull of the city kept getting stronger, kept pulling me deeper and deeper into that abyss. I know that I can never escape. I've finally realized the truth. So here I am on Halloween, 20 years to the day from that horrific night, back in my hometown. Nobody knows I've come. Not my agent, not even my parents. I parked my car in the municipal lot by the drugstore, and I'm walking across town just as the street lights are beginning to flicker on, watching all the kids in their costumes, bouncing from door to door with a cheerful trick-or-treat, collecting candy bars and sour gummies. It's not that different from when we went trick-or-treating all those years ago, though I don't see any groups of unsupervised 9-year-olds now. Probably for the best. I walk slowly, taking in the cool night air and the sounds of childhood fun, all those memories being made. Watching them, I wonder how different my life would have been if it hadn't been for the Black City. I've been to so many therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists. Hell, I've even had a sweat lodge ceremony done by a shaman to try to purge those demons from my soul. None of it worked, because I could never convince myself that it was all in my head. I could never convince myself that it wasn't real. It was all just a bad dream I had while I was lost in the woods. I can't convince myself of that for 2 reasons. The first reason, and you might have guessed this based on my accelerated book release schedule lately, is that my dreams and imaginings of the Black City are gaining strength. The visions and thoughts and my connection to the city continue to grow and become more vivid, more terrifying. And I have realized that it's finally getting ready to reappear. The second reason sits heavy in my right pocket. That coin, the silver coin that I picked up in the city 20 years ago, I have kept with me all this time. I've shown it to everyone, from my parents to my therapists to an actual scientist. And to them, it's just a coin. There's nothing special about it, but none of them can look directly at it for more than a moment or two. Nobody can translate it. It's a mystery that, for reasons known only to me, no one wants to solve. The porch lights are starting to go out now. There are fewer kids on the streets. I see a little mermaid yawning as her father carries her back home. It is almost time. I can feel it now. I feel the city calling me. I turn left and head up Barn Street, my hands shaking as my feet lead the way. The road is there, with the luminaria flickering like witch lights, exactly as I remember them. I don't hesitate. I don't even slow down as I turn left and head onto the road. The Black City is calling to me. Kerr and Vulturous and the Empress of Crows and all the other horrors are calling to me. And finally, after all these years, I must heed their call. I must go home to the Black City.